So hi everyone, I'm Lois, a graduate assistant with the Center for Indigenous Educational Research at University of Toronto, and I am very pleased to welcome everyone to today's Talk with the Student Speaker series. Thank you all for joining us and for supporting the CIR events. I see a lot of familiar faces, so it's great to see everyone here. For some logistics, please note that today's talk will be recorded. And you are most welcome to turn on your cameras if you would like, and if you feel comfortable doing so, but you are asked to kindly keep yourself on mute during the presentation today. At the end of the talk, we're going to have some time for questions and discussion, so please feel free to share comments or questions in the chat as they come up. So now, to begin, I wish to acknowledge that the land on which the University of Toronto operates is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. In order to reflect further upon the meaning of this acknowledgement, and to also invite others to reflect in similar ways in their own spaces, I situate myself as a settler of European ancestry who has benefited from the destructive colonial project on this land. This is a violent project which has worked for multiple centuries to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their homelands, cultures, and knowledges, to instead impose settler European lifestyles and values. This violence is ongoing through the settler colonial project. I have also grown up, as perhaps others of us have, without really reflecting deeply on the importance of land itself. For this reason, today I wish to express my gratitude for the land, for nurturing us and for caring for us, and for the Indigenous stewards and defenders of the land who continue to resist ongoing settler colonialism. I acknowledge my own responsibility to likewise resist and deconstruct harmful colonial narratives, working towards the goals of land back and fostering responsible, reciprocal, and caring relationships, both with one another and with the land. So in this spirit of relationship, I am very pleased to present our speaker for today, Harriet Akanmori. Harriet is a PhD candidate in the Social Justice Education Department at OISE, and her research explores the intersection of education and criminology, specifically the school-to-prison pipeline in the Greater Toronto Area. Harriet, thank you so much for coming, being here today to share your research. Now I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to start, just give me a minute. Am I sharing my screen? Hello?
I'm sorry, Harriet, I've got your screen up. Can you see it?
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, good. So I don't need to share?
No, I'm sharing your screen here.
Whew.
Just let me know when I should. Just let me know when I should switch the slide.
So let's go to the next as yes. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be given this presentation. I'd like to start with, I thank you very much, Lois, for the land acknowledgement. As a person of African descent, I do have a land acknowledgement which is Afrocentric in nature, which I would like to also say, and I would like to start with something traditional. As an African Indigenous student at the University of Toronto, I wish to acknowledge the land on which this university operates and the land for which for the past decade I have lived, worked, studied, and thrived. For thousands of years, this land has been the traditional and ancestral lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. Sorry if I don't say that right. Most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit River First Nations. And today, I acknowledge this place as home to still still to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to live, study, and work on this land. Having said that, I would like to, as a person of African descent, also give an Afrocentric acknowledgement of this land. And I want to sincerely thank Ian Brown and Tasha Williams for sharing this with me. It's adapted from their original. As an Indigenous African, I acknowledge that these historical caretakers of the land that I just mentioned, on which I'm privileged to dwell, were displaced, and that their lands were stolen and declared private property through the same logics of colonization that enslaved my African ancestors. Today, therefore, I also acknowledge my African ancestors who were stolen from their ancestral homelands on the African continent and forcibly resettled to the Americas and the Caribbean on ancestral lands cared for by the Caribs, the Tainos, and the Arawaks nations. Lands which were also captured and violently restructured into Euro-colonial sites for the exploitation of natural resources through the enslaved labor of my ancestors. And although we have survived all this, to this day, as Black bodies, people of African descent worldwide continue to bear the impact of this historical tragedy and continue to be victims of its consequences through ongoing colonization and neo-colonization. As a Black educator, I acknowledge the dispossession and oppression of colonization continues after slavery through globalization and current neoliberal policies, impacting all areas of Black life, including education. My research study serves as an example of what it can mean to stand in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of Canada while honoring the worth of my African indigeneity and that of my fellow Africans on the continent and the resilience of all peoples of African descent in the diaspora. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Next, please. Okay, so I want to say a very big thank you to everybody who has joined to hear this presentation. And to begin, I really must acknowledge my professor, Professor George Day, on whose shoulders I stand to do this work in the Black community. We cannot talk about Afrocentricity in Ontario without mentioning his name and the establishment of the TDSB Afrocentric Alternative School. Therefore, this study aims to extend that effort in the socio-legal front, and I'm grateful for that door of intellectual opportunity Professor Day has opened to me. I also must express my gratitude to Professor John Potelli and Dr. Migdalena Todorova for being on my thesis committee. I also thank the Ghanaian community in the Ghana and the greater Toronto area for their wonderful support for this research process and for the willingness of the community elders and leaders, professional groups, parents, youth, all to engage in the thought-provoking conversations this study has generated. And I dedicate this effort to them. Last but certainly not the least, I thank my colleague, Grace Gallo, who has encouraged me greatly as I prepared for this presentation, as well as my family for their enduring support. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to give a general overview. I'm just going to introduce and give a context to the study, how I came to the study and my inspiration for the study. I'll talk about my positionality, and from there talk about the main concepts that I've come across in my study that I think will be of interest to many of us. Next, please. So I'm going to start with the context. And My main context for doing this study is the multicultural nature of Canada. Multiculturalism means that there are different, there's a diversity of people, diversity of cultures, diversity of languages, and diversity of perspectives. And it is hoped that as Canada has embraced a culture, a policy of multiculturalism, and is very proud of it, it will also, you know, the promise of diversity, inclusion, and equity will also become more and more pronounced. But for now, we all know that there are incidents of discrimination. There are issues that we're dealing with. The Black community in particular is facing anti-Black racism. We know that the Indigenous community continues to fight to be treated equitably. And so this was something that struck me as I wanted to do this study. It is the national policy of multiculturalism. Thank you very much. Next, please. So there are three things that multiculturalism promises us: that there'll be diversity, there'll be inclusion, and there'll be equity. And what do we mean by that? So by diversity, we are thinking that there is a wide presence and a wide range of human qualities and attributes within any group, any organization, in the society. And these dimensions of diversity include, but are not limited to, ancestry, culture, ethnicity, gender identity, language, physical and intellectual abilities, race, religion, sex, sexual organization, and socioeconomic status. When we talk about inclusion, we're talking about policy and practice based on the principles of acceptance and inclusion of all. So all youth or all individuals should be seeing themselves reflected in the Canadian curriculum, in the physical and surroundings, and in the broader environment in which diversity should be honored and all individuals respected. And when we talk of equity, we are not talking only about a condition, we are talking about a state of fair and inclusive and respectful treatment of all and all individuals. And equity does not mean treating people the same without regard for their individual differences. That is not equity. So next slide, please. So what is the promise of diversity all about? The former Minister of Education, Michael Adams, wrote something really interesting, which I want to just highlight. And he saw the Canadian National Project of Multiculturalism and the welcome of diversity as an effort to live in a country of peace and prosperity with laws that are just. That's number one, with people who are humane and with citizens of all backgrounds, and where they encounter equal opportunities when they set out to really realize their potential and contribute to their communities, participate in the Canadian economy, and engage in the Canadian political system. And the question is, are all people actually experiencing this? Next, please. I want to talk, basically my studies have been about the school to prison pipeline here in Canada, but I want to talk about Canadian law, a little bit about the law. To all extent and purposes, Canadian law is based on European or British common law. What do I mean by that? The legal system of Canada, while it's considered a pluralist one, it's founded on the English common law system of the British Empire, as well as the French civil law system inherited from its French Empire past, and then more recently, Canada has incorporated some First Nations law systems such as restorative justice, and the Canadian Constitution provides a very good framework for these three legal systems to interact and operate. So definitely it's very Eurocentric as a legal framework, and doesn't really take much consideration for non-European peoples. And so the criminal law in Canada evolved with whiteness as the norm and did not account for other minorities, especially people of African descent. Secondly, the policy of multiculturalism must bring to and reflect the diversity that we're talking about, that Canada is very proud about, and be also equitable. Then there must be inclusion at every systemic and institutional level that matters in society. And for the youth that I'm so concerned about, it means in the schools and also in the youth justice system. So what it means is that right now, the legal system does not consider the life circumstances, the experiences, nor the perspectives of Canadian people of African descent to any appreciable extent. Finally, with respect to my study, I am highlighting the lack of African-centeredness in the justice system, particularly in sentencing options and rehabilitation programs. Those are my main areas of concern. And for Black youth and their communities, that calls for a recognition of their unique historical and social context of colonialism, slavery, oppression, and continuing socioeconomic marginalization in Western context. So this is where my study is heading in terms of, so I want to talk about what inspired. Can we move on? Next one, please. What inspired these ideas and thoughts? The first was the International Decade for People of African Descent that the United Nations inaugurated for 2015 and 2024. So I wanted to take advantage of that window and situate my study in something that was meaningful to my community and meaningful, you know, to me as a person of African descent. Can we go to the next, please? In December 2014, the UN General Assembly resolution proclaimed the International Decade for People of African Descent. And the Secretary General of the time, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, said, we have to remember that people of African descent are amongst the most affected by racism, and too often they face denial of basic rights, such as access to quality health services and education. But not only that, especially access to justice, you know, justice that considers who they are. So from there, I want to move to the next one, please. So when this resolution was adopted, there were a few facts that I want to highlight. That it was declared for a decade 2015 to 2025. The theme for the International Decade is People of African Descent, Recognition, Justice, and Development. Very important, recognition of what they're going through, justice, which is often denied them, and then development, because they're behind in everything. The fact is that there are about 200 million people who identify as being of African descent in the Americas, and many millions more live in other parts of the world outside the African continent. And so the decade is dedicated to people of African descent. When we say recognition and justice and development, justice for me is the key. I'm going to be focusing on the justice aspect. And in proclaiming this decade, the international community was being asked to recognize that people of African descent represent a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and protected. And it's something that it's going to be a recurring theme as I talk, because I have not felt that looking at the education system and the justice system within that paradigm of the school to prison pipeline, that much is being done for our youth of African descent. Can we move on, please? Thank you. So the other thing that inspired this study was when I got to know about the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also. Very, very interesting document and process. It's a very, very comprehensive. Now, one point I want to highlight again is that in Canada here, we often point to the US as exhibiting the height of anti-Black racism. But we have to recognize that there has been disturbing news in Canada too, in Ontario and in the GTA also, about several issues related to anti-Black racism. And in Toronto in particular, where what I'm really concerned about regarding Black youth is the over-policing, high rates of police violence, racial profiling and carding of Black males, discrimination in their access to justice, fairness and upholding the human rights of people of African descent in the justice and law enforcement systems, and the disproportionate numbers of Black children and youth in care in Children's Aid Society and the youth criminal justice system. And then the educational push out of the past decade from the early to mid 2000s, and the resulting dropout and prison to pipeline, school to prison to pipeline trends that we saw. All these have been very worrying trends, and all this has demanded that people of African descent seek even more creative ways to achieve equity and social justice, apart from presenting a unique opportunity to underline the important contributions made by people of African descent to Western societies. The UN Declaration for the Decade of People of African Descent also presented a good framework for nation states to work collaboratively with the Black communities to find concrete measures that will address racism, racial discrimination, and related marginalizations, and thereby promote a full inclusion of Black peoples in every sphere of society. And we are yet to see a full manifestation of that here in Canada. We look forward to it, we push for it, and we hope it will come. So it's really significant that within this window of time, to 2015 to 2025, that through the untimely and disturbing death of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement gained worldwide recognition and momentum, and raised global consciousness of anti-Black racism to a degree that we had never before achieved. So now I want to talk about the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and why it fascinates me. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples provided a very strong articulation of globally shared Indigenous worldviews. And this allowed across regions and continents. We have to understand that there are Indigenous people all over the world, and they really do share very similar worldviews, whether they're Indigenous people in Australia, South America, the Hawaii, Africa, here in the Americas, what we call the Red Indians of the US, and our own Aboriginal peoples of Canada, we really do share very similar worldviews. It's really interesting. And the United Nations Declaration, in putting all its articles and so forth and so on, really brought that out clearly. And all Indigenous peoples can identify with the principles that they have highlighted. They have 23 the charter is a very comprehensive charter, and it outlines 23 key principles. And so I wish to highlight 5 of those. Can we go to the next, please? Okay, so the first that I want to highlight of the principles is that the charter recognized the urgent need to respect and promote the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, which derive from their political, economic, and social structures, and from their culture and spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, especially their rights to lands, territories, and resources, especially in the case of settler colonial states like Canada. They also welcome the fact that Indigenous people are organizing themselves for political, economic, social, and cultural enhancements. And I want to underline social and cultural enhancements, because that is where their well-being comes, and then the political and economic follow, in order to bring an end to all forms of discrimination and oppression wherever they occur. They also recognize in particular the right of Indigenous families and communities to retain shared responsibility for the upbringing, training, education, and well-being of their children, consistent with the rights of children. Now, why I'm interested in this is because communities are supposed to be allowed to share the responsibility for the well-being of their children and their youth. So if the youth are getting into trouble, the communities have to be allowed to engage with the system to help rehabilitate or set the children back where they should be and ensure their well-being. So when I look at the Black community and the relationship they have with law enforcement, I'm not seeing this, and that is a matter of concern for me. Recognizing and affirming that the Indigenous individuals are entitled, with all human rights recognized, they're entitled to possess collective rights and which are indispensable to their existence, well-being, and integral development as peoples. So minority communities do have a right by human rights standards to be able to, be self-determine and be able to decide how culturally and socially they can best thrive, and this must be respected. Finally, recognizing that the situation of Indigenous people varies from region to region and from country to country. As a Black Indigenous woman, I know that my situation is different from an Indigenous Aboriginal First Nations person in Canada. However, they are Indigenous and so am I. And that is the understanding that I hope that we'll all come out of this presentation from. The significance of national and regional particularities and various historical and cultural backgrounds should be taken into consideration. And this is something that I'm pushing for very passionately. Now, in addition to these, the 23 principles, out of which I have only highlighted 5, the declaration also contains 46 articles, out of which I only want to highlight a few. Next, please. Good. The key articles, I'm just going to highlight 5 out of the 46 and work with just 2 of them. So I'll quickly go through a very run. 11, Indigenous people have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs, including the right to maintain, develop, and protect the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, including things like archaeological, historical sites, artifacts, design, ceremonies, technologies, visual, performing arts, and literature. So the culture. 14, Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing in education their own language in a manner that is appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching. We will come back to some of these later. 15, they have the right to dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. For me, it's not just education, but all the systems that undergird our social institutions. So Indigenous people have the right to participate in decision-making matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own Indigenous decision-making institutions. I'm very excited about that one because this is where I'm actually focusing, where as a community, people of African descent can come together and look at how they can participate actively in decision-making in the institutions that concern us, like the schooling, the social work institution, the youth justice institution, etc., etc. So finally, the Article 23, Indigenous people have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to development. And in particular, they have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining health, housing, and other economic and social programs that affect them as far as possible, to administer such programs through their own institutions. And we're going to see how this has played out. So next slide, please. Okay, so, oh, those two more. Okay, so there are two more. We can skip them and continue. Yeah, good. Now, I'm going to focus on these key articles, 34 and 40. These are where I'm really focusing on for my study, where Indigenous people have the right to promote, develop, and maintain their institutional structures, their distinctive customs, spirituality, traditions, procedures, practices, and in the cases where they exist, juridical systems or customs in according to international human rights law. I am supremely interested in Article 34 because I am pushing for an Afrocentric rehabilitation program within the youth justice system. And everything that I can use to justify it, I'm grabbing. So this is one of my key articles. Article 40 also says, one of my key, Indigenous people have the right to access to and prompt decision through just and fair procedures for the resolution of conflicts and disputes with the state or other parties, as well as effective remedies for all infringements of their individual and collective rights. Such as decisions shall give due consideration to the customs, traditions, rules, legal systems of the Indigenous people concerned, and international rights. As I've already said, I'm really interested in the legal system. Can we move on, please? Apart from the two articles, I'm also interested in the two principles. So I'm working with these four. So recognizing the urgent need to promote the inherent rights, as we read, and then recognizing the situation of the fact that Indigenous people vary from region to region. Why am I harping on that? I'm harping on that because as an African Indigenous person on Canadian soil, I know that when they say Indigenous, immediately everybody's mind goes to First Nations Aboriginal peoples. But I want also for us as a people to be recognized, because there have been people of African descent from Turtle Island for hundreds of years. They've been a part of Canadian history and Canadian social fabric. And I think that it is time that they were also recognized as being indigenous to this land, because they were here a long time ago, hundreds of years, 200, 300 years, I think. So we need to recognize that from region to region, from country to country, people have peculiarities and different histories and cultural backgrounds, but they are still indigenous people. Thank you. Next one, please. Now I want to talk about my positionality and how I come to this study. And yes, so I am a Ghanaian to start with, from West Africa, a very beautiful country, very colorful country, people who are very friendly and open, and it's a very vibrant country. And I was born in Ghana, spent much of my childhood in the UK until my father, who was a research scientist, observing the discrimination in British society, decided that his daughters would be much better off getting their secondary education back in our own country, Ghana. And his main concern, being grounded in our own African identity, would be the basis of our future success. And he was right. His 6 children all boast of postgraduate education and sound professional careers. He died a happy and accomplished man, and I'm dedicating my PhD studies to his memory. And I look at the situation of my family and that of my relatives that decided to remain indefinitely in the UK. And I said to myself, my father was wise, because indeed his aim was to ground us in our Africanness and our Ghanaian cultural identity. And he said, after you finish university, your first degree in Ghana, you can go anywhere you want. But that was his rule. He wanted us to be strong and be proud of who we are, because he saw it, cultural capital was our strength. And so I think this is how I come to the topic that I've come to. And so when I came to Canada, in Ghana, people take education really seriously and are very eager about education. So I came here and I realized that there was something going on in my community. The kids were getting so disengaged with schooling, dropping out, and then some of them were getting into trouble, and I could not comprehend what was happening. So that was how I came to this study and this interest, seeking Afrocentric ways to lift up these children. And from my location as a scholar, I'm claiming and seeking a space for the recognition of African indigeneity and indigenous knowledges as one of the valid multiple ways of knowing in a society that most of the time would consider indigenous to be synonymous to Aboriginal. Then the question arises, who is indigenous? And as I sought to reclaim my African indigeneity on Canadian soil, I had long and hard thoughts about this for 3 reasons. Next, please. So I decided to reclaim my indigeneity and use it as a launching pad for my research. And my whole concept was the idea of Sankofa. Sankofa is an Akan symbol that says, go back and take what you have lost, reclaim your past knowledges, reclaim your lost self, reclaim what you have thrown out for the past, because the people who don't know what their past is cannot determine what their future will be. So I decided it is time for me to think about who I am as an African person and work from my location as an African person. So Sankofa is the conceptual framework for my studies and what I'm doing. Next, please. Now, the questions that were going on in my mind as I sought to reclaim my African indigeneity in a settler colonial land is 3. The question of the place and land, right? The question and place of land in indigenous thought. We all know, and I believe Wambui was the one who talked to us about land, the concept of land in East Africa and in all over Africa. Land is blood, okay? Let's put it like that. Land is everything. I mean, if you don't have land, you don't have a root. So I thought, being on Canadian land, leaving my African continent behind, how do I now reclaim my indigeneity? And then I got to know more about cartographies of indigeneity and the fact that we conceptualize indigeneity as relational and transnational. And it's a category that defies borders and localism. And with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it is lodged, they have articulated it clearly that indigeneity is lodged on different lands, geographies, and spaces. And Day, Hall, and Rosenberg 2000 outlined this very, very clearly and articulate that concept very well. Secondly, I was thinking about the place of cultural memory and cultural knowledge depository when we are claiming indigeneity. When we claim our indigeneity, we understand land as more than a physical space. Okay, it's more than a physical space. Land now becomes, and even talking about the question of land and indigenous thought, we conceptualize the indigenous as also being an international category, who presents this and so therefore we can present a substantive vindication of African subjectivities on the map of indigeneity. And any discussion of settler colonialism can never be complete without engaging African indigeneity. And Harris, Day 2017 and Harris 2019 talk about this because Black African bodies were crucial to the settler colonial nation. Kin 2013, Kin 2020, Maynard 2017 also talk about this. Black African bodies were the main bodies that were used to establish settler colonial nations. So you cannot talk about indigeneity without ours, no matter where it is. And when it comes to the land and earth teachings of relationality, sharing, reciprocity, connections, mutual independence, building communities and relationships, and highlighting social responsibility and accountability. All these are embedded in African indigenous knowledges and epistemic value systems. That fact is not beyond contestation. And therefore, these are the ways in which I worked through my questions of how can I reclaim my African indigeneity in settler colonial land. Thirdly, the place of culture, yes. In terms of the question of cultural memory and cultural knowledge in claiming indigeneity, we understand, as we said, that land is more than a physical space. It's a site of knowing from which we reclaim our social, psychic, cultural, and spiritual memories as living forces, Simpson 2007. And indeed, if I take a walk, whether it's a walk through an African's forest or a Canadian woodland, and I am breathing and meditating within that, it's the same thing. It's just that I've changed location. So adopting the symbolism of Sankofa, go back and get what was lost, as the conceptual framework of my study really allowed me to allude to the power of knowing your history and your cultural knowledges. And finally, one powerful thing was the body as a site of knowledge and indigenous identity. My body carries me from Africa to Canada. When I moved in space and came here, I did not lose my indigeneity, nor my identity, my cultural identity. Why? Because indigeneity, indigenous knowledges and cultural memories reside in the body. And this legitimizes my claim to indigeneity as an African body on Canadian soil. And Day, Hall, and Rosenberg 2002 articulate that beautifully. So knowledge originates from a local place. Knowledges are place-based understandings of surrounding environments within those localities. So while it is true that African Indigenous knowledges can be conceptualized as home ground knowledges associated with the long-term occupancy of the African soil, it is also true that they are embodied in my cultural memories, in my cultural identity. I brought it with me. And so that settled for me the disturbance that was going on and the questioning that was going on of how do I reclaim my African indigeneity in a settler colonial land. Next, please. Now, I want to talk a little bit about spirituality because the Canada's First Nations peoples have, since the onset of the recognition of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Independence Peoples, there has been a resurgence of Indigenous spirituality all over the world, all over the world. Even in Africa, the lesser known groups are now asserting themselves and demanding to be recognized in all ways possible. So spirituality is a key thing. And sometimes it's like a floating idea out there. I want us to just think about what is spirituality and how does it come into this legal system? Because they have taken the lead and began to use their spirituality to create equitable structures in the legal system to benefit their community, and they've been an inspiration to me as I did my research. So, what is spirituality? Dorsey, Keegan, and Guzetta define spirituality as the essence of our being, the essence that permeates our living and infuses our unfolding awareness of who and what we are, what our purpose is, and it becomes our inner resources, and it shapes our life journey. So reflection of diversity in society by taking cognizance of the reality of spiritualities other than Eurocentric traditions in not only knowledge production, but in all our social relations and structures and institutions. The idea that cultural or indigenous non-Eurocentric values can contribute meaningfully, not only to student learning and their growth, to education in general, and also in all spheres of what we do. For example, of concern to me is rehabilitation programming in the youth justice system. It is so Eurocentric, it does not resonate with our Black youth. And so they are disinterested and therefore they don't benefit from what is going on. And that is why there's a lot of recidivism. They come out, they go back. Things are not changing. And it's because we need to look at the spirituality of these youth and give them what speaks to that spirituality. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about how Indigenous people have managed successfully to infuse their spirituality into the legal system. As I read to you earlier about the three arms of the Canadian law, the British, the French, and more recently in history, the Aboriginal. So I want to talk about the Gladio. For those who have not heard of it, I'm going to very quickly rush to the Gladio. I want to talk about the Gladue Principles, the Gladue Report, and the Gladue Court in a landmark Supreme Court of Canada case, 1999. It was the versus of the Republic versus Gladue. Now, who was this Gladue? To give a brief context for those who might not know, it refers to a case that is considered a landmark Supreme Court of Canada decision. Gladue was full name Jamie Tannis Gladue. She was a 19-year-old Cree woman in British Columbia. She stabbed and killed her husband after chasing him with a knife during an argument. And she was charged with second-degree murder, but pleaded guilty to manslaughter. And though the trial judge heard that she had attended counseling for substance abuse, spent time completing her grade 10, and she showed remorse for her actions while on bail. He still sentenced Gladio to 3 years in prison. She appealed this sentence, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court based on a section of the Criminal Code 7182. And that section advises lower courts to consider an Aboriginal and Indigenous offender's background and their circumstances, and proposes that as far as reasonable, all available sanctions other than imprisonment should be considered for Aboriginal offenders in particular. And that was why she appealed the judgment. Anyway, it went to the Supreme Court, and even though the Supreme Court agreed in principle that according to that section 7182E, and I'm going to show it shortly, of the Criminal Code, that a judge must consider, or a court must consider, the high rate of Indigenous offenders and seek to recommend restorative justice practices instead of incarceration. In this case, the Supreme Court chose to uphold Jamie Gladio's sentence of 3 years imprisonment. And the judge noted that she was, number one, she was not living on the reserve at the time of the murder, and therefore the section did not apply in her case. But the judge was careful to explain that from that time onwards, section 712E of the Criminal Code must be seriously considered for Aboriginal people. And so that was why it became a landmark, because soon after, what is called the Gladue Principles were implemented. And what are the Gladue Principles? We're going to look shortly. We'll follow, and then there were also the Gladue Reports and the Gladue Courts were subsequently created. And we're going to look, next slide, please, very shortly at what these are. So I want to quickly go over the code that we are talking about, because it is this same code that I am using for my research and as justification and rationale for the work I'm doing. And what does it say? The fundamental purpose of sentencing is to protect society and to contribute, along with crime prevention, to respect for the law and maintenance of a just, peaceful, and safe society by imposing just sanctions that have one or more of the following. And the ones in blue are the ones I'm very interested in. Yes, we want to denounce unlawful conduct and harm done to victims or to the community that is caused by unlawful. Indeed, these two things that I have in black, deterrence of the offender and separating offenders from society awareness, that's incarceration. But I'm more interested in the fact that you have to assist in the rehabilitation of offenders, and then provide reparation for harm done to victims, apart from promoting a sense of responsibility and acknowledgement of the harm they have done to the victim. So these 3 in blue, or 4 in blue, are my main, and this is what she was referring to. Next slide, please. Next, please. So what is the Gladue Principle? The Gladue Principle is a sentencing principle which recognizes that Aboriginal peoples face racism, inequities, and systemic discrimination in society and in the criminal law system, and called for legislative reform to revise the legal frameworks in order to create crucial arrangements to address these problems. Are these the same issues that the people of African descent are facing? Yes, indeed, it's the exact same thing. And that's why I'm also focused on that. Apart from that, it also attempts to deal with the crisis of overrepresentation of Aboriginal peoples in custody through changing how judges sentence them. Gladio instructs the judges to consider the following factors when sentencing or setting bail. Number 1, the unique systemic or environmental factors that they are in, and then Aboriginal cultural heritage and procedures. This is a very progressive principle. And I believe that as people of African descent who are second in line when it comes to overrepresentation in the justice system, and the fact that we also have unique systemic and environmental factors, that we also deserve to benefit from this. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the Gladue applies, first of all, to all self-identified Aboriginal people. It applies to all crimes for the Aboriginal people, and it applies to the, okay, so I'm talking about the report now. Now, the report is a sentencing or bail hearing report, and it's usually prepared by Gladue caseworkers at the request of the court. The report includes information about the person's background, history of residential schools, for example, whether they were involved in child welfare removal, whether they've experienced physical or sexual abuse, any underlying health issues, anything like anxiety or substance abuse. It also contains recommendations to the court by the Gladue caseworker what an appropriate and culture-specific sentence might be based on the background information that they have. So it's very individualized. Next, please. And what is a Gladue court? A Gladue court is a First Nations court where Gladue principles are regularly applied in sentencing Aboriginal people. The legal Gladue specialists, legal Gladue caseworkers, native courts and liaison workers, and restorative justice workers all come together to administer the law according to Aboriginal justice and strategy, and transformative justice circles called sentencing circles. And sometimes they're also called healing circles. So this is what Gladue Court is about. It balances the normal Canadian law, but really focuses on the culture-specific attention and service to the Aboriginal people. And this is what I'm also calling for, that the people of African descent in Canada deserve some consideration in this same manner, because we share very similar historical and colonial histories. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about, now that we've spoken a lot about the Indigenous Aboriginals, and I'm seeking a parallel something for the African community, I want to talk about the Afrocentric idea and Afrocentric model. As I was doing the research and trying to sensitize people to the idea of Afrocentricity in my community, I found many people said, what does this mean? What is all this Afrocentric? The Afrocentric idea is any model that considers people of African descent in planning whatever, whether it's a service or a program. You look at it from their location and involve their and use their resources, their culture, their knowledges to speak to their cultural identity as African, people of African descent. That is the whole general idea of Afrocentricity. And so it's a model that looks at people of African descent and provides culture-specific programming and services to them. Next, please. Now, my rationale for this study was two main things. I found that in the Youth Criminal Justice Act, they have also said very clearly that within the limits of fair and proportionate accountability, measures taken against young persons who commit crimes should, number one, respect their gender, ethnic, cultural, linguistic differences and respond to their needs of both, even Aboriginal people and racialized people, and of young people who have special requirements. And we know that Black youth do have special requirements, just as Aboriginal youth also do, and with the histories that they have of intergenerational trauma and all that. So it also gives, the Youth Criminal Justice Act therefore gives alternatives and possibilities for community-based alternative extrajudiciary measures. What does that mean? Communities can come together and create programs that they present to the justice system for consideration and assistance so that their kids are not always being sent into prison and incarceration, because it does not help. There are better things. And I'm so excited that the actual legal framework allows for that. And I just wonder why my community and the Black community in general, people of African descent, have not delved into this to take more advantage of it and come up with more programs for their youth in their community. And so this is one of the things that I'm doing in my researches, opening these things up for discussion so that conscientization can start going through and ideas will start coming for how we can best do these things. And I wanted to maximize the opportunities that the Criminal Justice Act gives to move away from deficit narratives of Black youth. So those were my real, my passion for doing this, the rationale for my study. Can we move on, please? Thank you. So number one, we look at the TDSB Alternative School. That's an Afrocentric school. And according to their website, it was established at the request of the Black community to address the high dropout rate and achievement gap that was affecting students of African descent. The school is focused on high academic achievement and building the motivation to succeed. I really love that, building the motivation to succeed, because these deficits, we're tired of hearing the deficit narratives, and they are dropping out and they're school to prison and they are getting gangs. We need to motivate them to succeed. And the school is reported to be enjoying a very high level of success and is doing well. So I just want to highlight that. And Professor Day was very key in the establishment of this school. And so I'm standing on his shoulders and I'm pushing the boundaries of that Afrocentric model and idea. Next one, please. Also, recently, this book was published, Afrocentric Social Work. It's a very dynamic book and published by a number of editors out of, just last May, out of Nova Scotia. I highly recommend it for reading. It's very moderately priced. All students can afford it. But if you are an African practitioner in health, in social work, in education, in any field, social services, I highly recommend it because it gives a very detailed way to be a person of African descent and practice Afrocentricity in your work. So within this racial and cultural framework, we offer a foundation. I just chose one quote that helps us to see what the book can offer, in which root meaningful responses to micro and macro levels of oppression that community members face. Embedding transformative to cultural shifts, we disrupt our engagement in the colonial system that have aimed to stamp out African Canadian people and our ancestors. African Canadian social workers engaged in the system as change agents collectively risk what Audre Lorde identifies as using the master's tools to address anti-Black racism in social work, and by embracing holistic Afrocentric practices. So shall we go to the next slide? I just want to demonstrate that Afrocentricity did not stop with the Afrocentric Alternative School. The idea and the model is catching up and is gone into social work. And now we have a model in the legal system, also out of Nova Scotia. So I want to just talk about this publication that I had, which is also being used in the legal system. And it's called The Impact of Race and Culture Assessments, IRCAs, in Sentencing African Canadians. Now, these assessments have begun in Nova Scotia, but I was in a forum where I had the discussions, and I know that it's coming very soon to Ontario, where the same way that the Gladue Report is being used, now there's a version which is Afrocentric and looks at African Canadian offenders, people of African descent. And it's based on that same section, 718 of the Criminal Code that I referenced in the case of Aboriginal offenders. And it's a framework that for making context-driven sentences for African Canadian offenders and considering race and systemic background factors in their sentencing. So all the assessments include a race and cultural component, including the psychological assessments. And these include information about the background, the Black offender's historical and current cultural context and background, and any systemic factors that may have impacted their life. For example, did they enter care? What kind of home or environment they live in. So, excuse me. So all these may have played a role in the offense, and they compiled this report. Good. They compiled this report to help determine the sentencing. Thank you. Next one, please. Now, why are these impact of race and culture assessments important now? I want you to look at this youth prison. I'm going to go to the next slide soon. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the super jail at Brampton, the Youth Roy McMurtry Youth Center, which was touted as going to be a very high-class super jail and take care of the kids. But the report is that Ontario's troubled youth deserve better care at the Brampton. It is not living up to its standards, and there's a better way. And if there's a better way, we better look for it. I think that incarceration is not the best. So what can we do? What can we do to get our youth something better? That is my aim. So that's why right now it is really important that we look at counter visions of justice. Can we go to the next slide? I think we're almost done now. So both the government and the judiciary are very much aware that, one, the needs of Black offenders are not being met in the prison system. Incarcerated Black offenders are treated worse than non-Black offenders. All this information came from the, just give me 1 second. The Department of Corrections, that's where it came from. And so, by that I refer to, just 1 minute, I'm looking for the information. Yeah, so in 2019, the Office of the Correctional Investigator, OCI, stated that even though Black inmates represented only 8% of the incarcerated population between 2008 and 2018, they accounted for 37% of all discrimination complaints to their office. So there's a lack of equity and a lack of care. They are overrepresented in disciplinary solitary confinement and the use of force incidents. And of particular significance to my study is what relates to the youth. The cultural needs of incarcerated Black offenders are not being met. There's a lack of cultural programming, cultural hygiene products, lack of attention to the culturally relevant community support that they should be given and allowed to enable them thrive and to be rehabilitated. So next slide, please. So all these mean that in general, African Canadian offenders serve a harsher sentence than the general population. And what is the way forward? It's okay to identify the problems and also talk about them and think, but what is the way forward? How can we solve this problem? Obviously, there's a need for a culture-specific approach to justice for African Canadian youth where I am concerned, I'm looking at the youth. African Canadians are really grateful to the dedicated struggle of our colleagues and academics and practitioners in Nova Scotia for their indomitable spirit and the relentless pushing of the boundaries to bring us the resources, the new book, African Social Work, and the new legal tool, the impact of race and culture assessments, which is also coming for implementation in Ontario. But these are enough reasons, I believe, for the Black communities and the community program providers to prepare themselves to advocate for and to participate in providing culturally relevant solutions that will benefit our youth in the new future. As people of African descent, we are also grateful to Canada's Indigenous First Nation peoples because they've set a very good example by advocating for themselves and pushing for the implementation of the Gladue Principles, which are now articulated for Black people through the 3 main points of justification for considering systemic arguments in sentencing Black offenders. That is the judicial acknowledgement that there's systemic racism, the importance of historical and contextual information, and the salience of this information as a mitigating factor during sentencing decisions. So now the Gladue Report is being paralleled by the impact of race and culture assessments. And the Gladue Courts, which is the focus of my current research and the quest to determine how best African Indigenous concepts of restorative justice and traditional conflict mediation systems can be engaged to create a non-custodial alternative measure for dealing with our youth in conflict with the law at the community level. So my study proposes and encourages the Black community in the GTA to take advantage of these new provisions in the Youth Justice Act, which encourage innovative community-based alternatives to justice, and prepare and to leverage with the recent introduction with the IRCAs, which, like the Gladue Report for Indigenous people, seeks to use a culture-specific Afrocentric lens for doing pre-sentencing legal assessment of African Canadian youth offenders. The study is in progress and outcomes will be presented at another time, but I would like to conclude by sharing a few key concepts and insights gained so far. Next slide, please. Oh, please leave it there. Yeah, please go back. Yes. Now, a few weeks or a month or so ago, we heard a presentation by Professor George about elders in the African context. And I realized that elders are a key component of the restorative justice model that our First Nations peoples are running in their Gladue Courts. And I want to posit that African traditional society has always venerated and respected our elders, and the elders have always been an integral part of the community when it comes to conflict resolution and mediation. We call our elders chiefs, queen mothers. These are the traditional leaders. And then we also have family and clan heads who also work underneath these higher traditional leaders. We also have religious leaders and church elders. Ghanaians are extremely religious. The country is said to be 60 or so, 60 to 70% Christian. And there's also about a 10 or so, 15% Muslim. And people really do go to their places of worship. So religious leaders are very important components of our concept of eldership. And we have community leaders. For example, here in the Toronto Greater GTA, the Ghanaians are spread across the whole GTA, and they have all these cultural associations, because in Ghana, we have ethnic groups in the different regions. And we are all quite distinct in the way, the food, in the dance, in the dress, even though we share a common culture, but there are those ethnic or tribal distinctions. And there are leaders to all these tribal representations here. And they, together, my community has formed a very good elder council, which mediates issues when they arise. So that I wanted to point out the fact that we do have a very similar system, and therefore we can set up something that will parallel the Aboriginal restorative justice system, and that can work for us as Indigenous Africans. Next slide, please. In addition to that, the concept of mentorship and community building. We all know about Ubuntu. I am because you are. Africans are very communal living, and they have a communal culture, a culture of extended family. It's not a nuclear family system. And when you go, even the way traditionally in the society, the houses are arranged, it's like a round of houses or a square of houses, and different people live in there. Okay, it's like living in an apartment building, but on a horizontal level. And that really means that there's a lot of engagement and a lot of, and because of that, nobody ever saw upbringing of children as one family's prerogative. It takes a village to raise a child. It's a saying that comes from Africa. There's respect for older people, and in my community, every adult is auntie and uncle. So every child has hundreds of aunties and uncles, and they know that they are accountable for them, and that we are there. If they're doing something wrong, we can correct them like their parents do. And so these are concepts of mentorship in the community building that we have, that I know that the Aboriginal community also practices very closely. Apart from that, we see children as a blessing and an investment. The youth are the future and the pride and the hope of the older generation. And so what is happening in the community and the issues and the troubles that are happening is creating a lot of stress, and a lot of stress all around, and intergenerational friction. And so it's really important that we are able to garner all these things that are in our culture and use them to our advantage, because I believe that the mentorship that we have as a part of our culture can be used for rehabilitation of these youth who are getting into trouble. And so if we can structure ourselves. So I'm talking about also the social structure and cultural transmission. Indigenous ways of teaching and learning, knowing and being, cultural and Indigenous values are passed on orally through storytelling, folktales, wise saying, proverbs, and physically through the arts like traditional music and dance and aesthetic arts, painting, sculpture, and craft learning. We've always done this as father to son, mother to daughter. And I look at the Indigenous people here in Canada, and it's the exact same thing they do. The exact same thing. The bead work and all that, they pass on one, and the language they pass on. Can I get the next slide too? So I'm almost done. The concept of restorative justice. We know that we talk about connection to place. Yes. We are now here in Canada as people of African descent. Some of us have put roots in here. We are connected to this place while we keep the umbilical cord alive with our homeland, Africa, but we are connected to this place. And we also think about the interconnectedness of the accused, the victim, and the community. And because of that, just as the Aboriginal people have sentencing or healing circles and sentencing circles when there's problem, in African culture it's the exact same thing. When something happens, it hasn't happened to only the victim. The whole community is affected and interested in seeing that the balance and harmony is restored. So it is the same circular thing. Elders, community elders, victim and their families, perpetrator and their families, they all sit to do mediation and see how they can best sort the problem out, who is supposed to pay fines and who's supposed to do compensation. All that is done within this context with the Aboriginal community in the restorative justice. We do as Africans also. So restoring harmony for us is very key. Ghanaians are very peaceful people, and they do not like the harmony of the environment and the social environment to be disturbed. So when something goes wrong, you will find people trying to make peace. They are chief peacemakers. Maybe we should send some of them to you, Vladimir Putin. Yeah. So restoring harmony is really key, and reintegrating the errant person is, we don't throw anybody away unless you are really vile, but they always seek to bring people closer and bring people back into the circle. And I see that is exactly what is happening with the indigenous restorative justice practices here. And so next slide, please. So I want to just end by commenting on these parallels in Indigenous and Aboriginal tradition, Aboriginal and African traditional restorative justice. The ways of conflict resolution are very much the same. And I'm talking about the circles, we have that. The authority of elders in mediation and peacekeeping, same. Value systems, cultural values of community based on respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and relationship. Exact same for African communities. Circular and not linear concept of life. We believe, in fact, even more so, African traditional society has always believed in the interconnection of life, death, and continuity. In nature, everything is part of the whole setup. And so it has been very interesting to just watch and see how very similar Aboriginal culture is to African traditional culture. And so everything is in continuum, and because of that, we believe that whatever goes round comes round. And that's why whatever you do to your neighbor will come back to you. And therefore you give respect, you will gain respect. You act responsibly to other people, you get responsible behavior in return. So we really believe these are some of the parallels. Next slide, please. Apart from that, religion and spirituality. We believe, just like the Aboriginal people, that all elements in the universe are imbued with the spirituality. There's a belief in the great spirit for the Aboriginal people, and we believe in the supreme God, Onyankopon, or Twediampo Kwame, and similar creation stories, right? So that is Akan I just spoke. That's the name for God, the supreme God. And we believe in life and the personification of inanimate objects in the natural environment. People believe that the rivers, the caves, the mountains have life. In fact, Earth is called Mother Earth, Asasiya, Mother Earth in Ghana, in Akan. The river god of war is called Tano Akura, Old Man Tano, so the river is Tano, but he has a name, and he's believed to have attributes, We also believe in the power of shared harmony with all of creation, air, sea, and on land. And you go to Africa, and the indigenous farmers know how to preserve the environment for the future and have done so for many, many years until commercialization, westernized commercialization came, and people are cutting down and not observing those. They used to do land fallowing, they would divide the land, they would do this, leave the others fallow for 2-3 years, and that was working perfectly. And so I see that Aboriginal people are also very conscious about the environment also. They have been custodians of the land for millenniums of years, thousands of years, keeping the land until capitalism came and found them. And here we are with all this global warming going on. So the belief in ancestors and ancestral worship. I know Aboriginal people really believe in the spirits of their departed as being a part of their lives. In African traditional religion, like I said, it's a circle. Life and death it's just one, we move from one state of existence to the other. That's the belief. And so ancestral belief and the continuity of life between the living and the dead is very much a thing that we share with our Aboriginal people. Finally, Next, please. Finally, the sacredness of ritual and protocol. You cannot go to an African chief and just walk up there. No, 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 no. It doesn't happen. You can't even speak directly to the person. He has a linguist, and you must speak to the linguist, and the linguist will relay. So protocol, elder protocols and regalia is a very important thing. And I see that the same thing is what I see in the indigenous community. You cannot enter a community without doing the due, giving the due respect, the due greetings is the same thing. And then the idea of prayers, the smudging, the tobacco, and the, for us Africans, the pouring of libation, you know. So very much so, we share a lot in common with the people of indigenous people. Can I have the last slide, please? So in conclusion, I want to talk about the way forward, and it's towards an African-centered rehabilitation programming for youth of African descent. And by centering African-centered cultural values in rehabilitative programming, the study that I'm doing seeks to demonstrate that just as the Afrocentric school provided an alternative model for educating Black students in a manner that speaks to their Black identities, an African restorative justice model can contribute to the decriminalization of Black youth of African descent just as effectively as the Gladue Principles, the Gladue Report, the Gladue Courts have served to decriminalize Indigenous Aboriginal youth, you know, and divert them from the youth criminal justice system. We need to divert our youth from the youth criminal justice system. Now, what are some of the challenges that I have seen? The fact that there's so much diversity when you talk about Blackness. Even though the Black community in the GTA shares much in common, we are not homogeneous. We have Caribbean Blacks, we have Nova Scotian Blacks who are Canadian Blacks, we have North American, African American Blacks, we have Blacks from the continent of Africa, and even amongst us, there's big differences. There's East African Blacks, South African Blacks, North African Blacks, Central African Blacks, and believe me, wherever you go, the culture is a little different, even though we do share a lot in common. So this is one of the things that may be a challenge as I move forward and I'm thinking through. Final slide, please. So that diversity, and then also we all know that the legal system is a very conservative system. And that's why we do critical race theory, which now has become a culture war in the US. But because the legal system is so conservative and the wheels of justice reform grind so slowly, one of the things that I am wondering is how quickly can we move this ball forward, and how far the justice system will accommodate alternative measures. But nonetheless, we are willing to push and fight and advocate until the Aboriginal people did that and they got what they needed. And they've given us a good example that we want to follow. Yes, finally. Okay, so the recommendations that I have is that number one, this whole thing is limited to non-violent crime. If you commit violent crime and go and murder people, you will go to jail no matter what. So this is limited to non-violent crime, but the whole idea is to take one step at a time. For the immediate and short term, my study wants to pursue opportunities for non-violent offenders to be diverted from the youth criminal justice system. And then once that is established and running and successful, we begin to look at the medium and long term, how to salvage inmate activity. At that point, that's all that it may be, through appropriate culturally relevant educational programs and vocational training. Thank you very much. I come to an end at this point. Yes.
Harriet, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I know I learned so much, and it's been such a gift to have you here talking about your research. So thank you so much. I've seen some comments, so maybe you can look through them as well about the important work you're doing, Harriet. I do know we are quite over time because we had to start a bit later. But I do want to make space for any questions or comments. If people have any, feel free to maybe raise your hand or put it into the chat. I can read some of the comments.
She's on mute. Somebody wanted to talk, but I think she's on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, go ahead, Marie. Oh, we can't hear you, Marie. It says you're not muted, but we can't hear you. Okay, maybe while Marie is figuring out her tech.
Dorothy stands up. Yeah,
Dorothy.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. so excited. Please, 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 this will not end here. It must not end here. We have to move it in another direction, another dimension, to make sure that Canada, federal government of Canada hears about this and start implementation immediately. Immediately. No going back about it. Please, please. This is a very great work. In fact, I don't know how to celebrate my happiness and my joy right now. Hearing this, that we have a remedy. I mean, we have this is a solution, not even remedy. We have a solution for the our Black youths that are languishing, that have been destroyed. I'll call it completely destroyed in Canada. Please. My knees are on the ground. You know our tradition. So my knees are on ground to make sure that this is moved forward. However you're going to do it, we are here to help. We are here to, devote our life for this to come to pass. Let me keep it short because of
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your encouragement.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dorothy. I see we have another hand from Dorothy Odarki.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. Harriet, good work. Good work, my good friend Harriet. You mentioned briefly, and this is central to your research, you mentioned briefly that the incarcerated Black youth do not find the rehabilitation programs in the institutions in which they find themselves interesting because they're Eurocentric and that you're proposing an Afrocentric alternative. So if, I know there isn't a lot of time, but if ever so briefly, you can describe what you mean by these Afrocentric, or give one example, and also at least one example of an alternative in terms of rehabilitation programs. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I can start with the personnel, the services. If you have a Black youth who is suspicious already of whiteness, or a white police officer, a white parole officer, or a white counselor for that matter, and you are sending this young man to a white counselor for rehab, how much of that do you think he's going to absorb? But if you found somebody from it may not be from his country, but a Black person who sympathizes and empathizes with him and can put herself or himself in that child's shoes, he will be able to draw that child in, to listen and to engage. Because we have to think very carefully, because the children's situation is precarious. And for that reason, everything we need to do, thinking outside the box included, we have to do. So that's one example. The other example is, for example, the activities that they do. You know that our children like sports. There are specific things that they are interested in. If you go and put somebody who is behind bars and you give them something like, let's say, what are some of these games that are quite foreign to us? If you give them this thing to write rap music, for example, and be creative, they're going to engage big time. But if you send them to do something else that has nothing to do with their background and their experience and their interests, they'll be disengaged and bored and get into more fights and troubles, even within the jail system. So these are some of the things I'm talking about. Even the food they are served, you know, there's some food you give them, you know very well that they can't tolerate it, they don't like it. For example, sugar, lots of sugar. It's not a thing that we in our African culture actually do. We don't do lots of sugar. And you load these children with drinks and sugar and pops and things, and they get hyperactive, and then they get into trouble. So these are some of the things that I'm talking about. They need to be carefully thought about, but everything with an Afrocentric lens to speak to their identity. That's what I mean by African-centered. You know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wellington.
Thank you, Harriet. I see Juliet also has a hand.
Yes, Juliet.
Hi, everyone.
She's my vice president of the Ghana Association.
Thank you, Miss Harriet. Your research is incredible, and I'm so proud of the work that you're doing. I just want to say that, you know what, everything that you're speaking of speaks to me in so many levels, having the Afrocentric lens for everything, because even in healthcare, as I'm a health practitioner, in healthcare, we do see that when people come in and they're being diagnosed with certain things, and when they come in and they see that the person that's, you know, attending to them have similar cultural background and understand where they're coming from in order, you know, for example, I'm a diabetes educator, like I'm able to speak to them in that lens and give them what some of the cultural foods, it just makes it so much easier for them to learn and to be able to, you know, learn that what they need to learn to incorporate that into their daily activity and to improve their health. So this is incredible work, and I think we should take this further, like my sister Dorothy said earlier, to try to get something to help the youth and to help people of African descent, because this will help tailor things from that perspective, having our cultural background, having our people be the lead on this, right? Because then that the similarity is there, even though we all have different, we're still very similar. So it will help us in order to rehabilitate the children, and for them to also, in that sense, for them to also have someone to look up to. Because growing up, when I first moved to Canada, I didn't have that many mentors to follow or to emulate after. So doing this process will also help them in the way of mentorship, because they're seeing that, you know what, people that come from their culture are doing great things and they're doing well, and they don't have to resort to that, you know, the criminal ways. So that will also, I feel, can empower them to also move forward. So I'm really, really happy with this. And I hope, like Sister Dorothy said, like we should move this forward and bring it to the level where everybody can benefit, and it will help the whole society, right? Because if we're doing well, then everybody's doing well as well. Yeah. So thank you so much for your research. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you for your purpose, your support. I really appreciate it. Yes. There's another hand up.
I don't see another hand right now, but thank you, Juliet, for your comments. I do see Marie's question in the chat. So she asks, my question is, the adaptation of the model is dependent on the conceptualization of African indigeneity. How can you overcome the resistance to the use of the concept?
I beg your pardon, can you say that quickly one more time?
Yeah, so Marie McLeod asks, my question is, the adaptation of the model is dependent on the conceptualization of African indigeneity. How can you overcome the resistance to the use of the concept?
Okay, so if you would notice, I went to lengths to tell you about my thought processes when I was reclaiming my indigeneity as an African on Canadian soil. And so I do recognize that there's pushback, and it's to be expected, right? Because the westernized colonial concept of indigenous is only linked to the soil. But Professor Dare teaches us that indigeneity resides in the body. Cultural memory resides in the body. You carry it with you. So I did not lose my indigeneity when I arrived in Canada. If I don't maintain it and seek it, like the Sankofa that I talked about, then I will lose it. Just as our third generation right now in my community is fast losing the culture, and the community is trying to speed up ways to engage them. And I see a hand up, Nee. So the pushback will come, but that doesn't deter me, because I have a very clear vision of what I want to do. And each bridge that comes, I will cross it accordingly. And most of it, as Professor Day always says, humility of learning. I'm very open to hearing what other people have to say, because it enriches my position and what I know. I learn something from here, I learn something from there, and I move on and add it to what I know. And if I can convince you of my position, I will do so. So it's a debate, it's a discourse, it's a learning, and we move forward that way. Yes, Prince Nee Ayman's hands are up.
Yes, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for that. As always, it's so nice to hear your thoughts and to hear you speak. Speaking as a first-generation Ghanaian in Canada, I find that a lot of the conversations I have with fellow first generations is the concept of almost adaptability, I want to say. They view a lot of the Ghanaian traditions as old-fashioned, and I'm not of the same breath to say the same. I think there's power, again, like you were saying, there's power in understanding your past in order to push for the future. But to what degree now, us as Ghanaians living in a foreign country, to what degree do we need to adhere to our past and create environments specifically for us, while also still being a part of the community of the space we're in, if that makes sense?
Yes, it does perfectly. I call you third culture kids. I'm an international school teacher, and one of the category of children that we have are these children whose parents do international jobs, and they're moving from culture to culture, and so they really don't have a distinct culture. They know a lot about everything. So you are third culture kids, the third generation of African children we have, and we understand. But you have to understand that culture is not static. It doesn't have to be old-fashioned. With each generation, you come and add your bit, and it keeps moving on. So I think it's the approach. Perhaps the adults have not approached it as well as they should, because they themselves need to understand a few things themselves. From the research I was doing, I'll quote one young man. He said, our parents who came here, they are running through the system without allowing the system to run through them. And I thought that was a brilliant analysis of what is going on. They are just so focused on the daily bread, paying the bills. They are not listening or hearing or seeing anything else. And so they're just running in through the system without absorbing what is going on and adapting. And that has caused intergenerational stress. And I admit it, I found it there in the interviews that I was doing. It came out clearly. And so I agree with you that there's a need to adapt. There's a need to modernize. And I think slowly that understanding is coming through, because they took the hard line of African parenting and it ended up not so well. And so people are beginning to bend back and try and listen and understand again. And luckily we have the second generation to bridge the gap, right? Those who are young adults now, who are able to really bridge the gap and speak to both sides. So with hope and with the hard work and with more community involvement together, we'll be able to, strike a balance, we'll be able to strike a balance. Thank you for that, Nee.
Thank you so much, Harriet, and thank you everyone for your questions. So now we've come to 2 o'clock, so I think we can probably wrap up. I see some clap hands. I wish we could all clap for you. That was excellent. So once again, Harriet, thank you so much for sharing your research with us all here today. It's been inspirational to hear about your truly transformative research on the justice system, and I really appreciate the time you've taken to share with CIER, OISE, and all of us today. And thank you everyone for coming to and engaging and asking questions. So I'm wishing everyone a lovely afternoon. And Harriet, if you want to say a few final words, I'll leave you.
Thank you very much. Is it possible to get are you saving the chat? I'd like to see the questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I will definitely share that with you.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Harriet. Thank you for all your great work. Thanks, everyone. Have a good
Juliet.
afternoon.
I really appreciate your presence.
Flax, wake up. Let's do it.
Yes,
Yes,
I agree. Take care,
Dr.
everyone.
Sansori is gone. Excellent.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Okay, bye-bye.